I got into this business because I wanted to be like Stevie Wonder." Lionel Richie would repeat that line for years, half as a confession, half as a map of where he came from. To him, Stevie wasn't just a star. He was the songwriter other songwriters looked up to. So when the day finally came that Stevie Wonder was in a car with him listening to a song Lionel had written, it felt like stepping into a dream. Stevie slid into the driver's seat, told Lionel to sit in the passenger side, turned the key, slipped a tape into the deck, and then closed his eyes as the music filled the car. In that small enclosed space, Lionel watched the very man he idolized nod along to his work. It was the kind of quiet approval that could shape an entire life. By the middle of the 1980s, that life looked perfect from the outside. Lionel Richie was being celebrated as the most romantic voice in America. His ballads floated through wedding halls, whispered from radios during late-night drives, and played softly in living rooms across the country. His face was familiar, his voice trusted. But beyond the stage lights and polished interviews, another story was unfolding, one almost no one saw in real time. Behind those love songs, the man himself was in freefall. The same voice that soothed millions was surrounded at home by rising tension, accusations of infidelity, flashes of uncontrollable anger, and a marriage that was quietly edging toward collapse. The brutality of it lay in the contrast. The public saw a calm gentleman who sang about tenderness. The private reality was of a husband drifting toward a breaking point he did not yet recognize. That contrast reached its most dangerous form one scandalous night in Beverly Hills. Police cars rolled up to a house that should have been just another private address. Reporters started to gather outside. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Inside those walls, the carefully guarded image of Lionel Richie, the perfect, safe, romantic figure, fractured in full public view for the first time. In that moment, fame stopped being a shield. It protected nothing. So what had pushed a black artist long seen as completely safe, marketable, and non-threatening into such a quiet yet bitter unraveling, and behind the timeless hits that never left the radio, who was Lionel Richie really? From this point forward, we enter a file most people never opened, a heartbreaking tragedy hidden for years behind sweet, reassuring love songs. Chapter 1. Collective Beginnings and the First Cracks. To understand the fall, you have to begin before the spotlight ever found him. Go back to 1968 Tuskegee, Alabama. Lionel Richie was not a legend then. He wasn't a superstar in waiting. He was just another skinny black student walking across the grounds of Tuskegee University, living in an American South, still carrying the scars of segregation. For many young black students, their escape didn't look like a stage or a stadium. It looked like a diploma, a job, a chance to climb out of poverty one slow step at a time. On thick, humid evenings, the campus took on a different life. Lionel and his classmates squeezed into cramped dorm rooms and basements where battered instruments leaned against faded walls. Guitar strings were frayed, drumheads were worn, amplifiers buzzed. The equipment looked broken, but the belief in that room was not. It was said that everyone there shared the same quiet conviction: if the outside world kept its doors locked, maybe music could pry one open. Out of that belief, the Commodores were born. There was no major label circling them, no lawyer drafting contracts, no manager drawing up a master plan. It was just a group of students who decided that if they were going to go anywhere, they would go together. They played in suffocating rooms, where sweat soaked their shirts, the thud of drums and the pulse of bass lines bouncing off peeling paint. Lionel wasn't the front man yet. He rotated roles, wrote songs, sang parts, and often didn't even bother to insist his name be highlighted. At that stage, no one was chasing individual glory. Inside the Commodores, a rule settled in early: if one person got left behind, then the whole group failed. That principle defined their early years. They slept in the same vans, shared the same cheap meals, and faced the same indifferent crowds on slow nights. For a while, that collective spirit held everything together. But leaving Tuskegee changed the air around them. As the band moved closer to Detroit, in the early 1970s things began to shift. The Commodore's hard-driving funk started attracting bigger crowds, louder reactions, and eventually industry attention. They were booked more often. They played hotter rooms. Their sound suddenly mattered beyond campus walls. It was during this period that something small but crucial began to happen, something members would only fully acknowledge years later. Lionel Richie started bringing different songs to rehearsal. While the band was built on explosive, up-tempo funk Lionel's, new material moved in the opposite direction. These songs were slower, softer, more intimate. They carried a personal weight that didn't quite fit the relentless energy of the rest of the set. At first the others saw it as simple experimentation. A band trying new colors. A songwriter stretching himself. They let him test these ballads between the louder tracks, treating them as side paths, not a new road. But the experiments didn't fade away. They multiplied. In 1974, when the Commodores signed with Motown Records, the environment around them changed sharply. The label didn't just listen to the band. They studied it. Every voice, every face, every small detail became part of a calculation. According to later accounts, it didn't take long for Motown executives to focus more closely on Lionel, the calm presence, the smooth tone, the quiet charisma. He was soon being called into private meetings the others didn't attend. No one announced anything directly. But backstage questions began to simmer. Why was Lionel meeting with the label alone? Why were certain songs suddenly credited mainly to him? From 1975 to 1977, Lionel wrote more and more ballads, steering further from the band's original raw funk core. There were rehearsals, former members later said, where the rest of the group simply stood around watching him at the piano, working through melodies while their usual high-energy sound was pushed to the margins. The shift was not declared in words. It arrived in a different form: silence. Lionel shared less. He asked for fewer opinions. Slowly he began to think and act like someone already one step ahead of the collective he had grown up with. Then, in 1977, Easy was released. Within weeks it spread through America like a quiet storm. Radio stations added it. Couples replayed it. Audiences sang along. For Motown, it was the confirmation they had been waiting for. Easy wasn't just a successful track by a band. It was proof that Lionel Richie's voice, his writing, and his presence could stand alone. After that, solo opportunities were no longer just rumors whispered in hallways. They arrived in real conversations held behind closed doors, where the other Commodores were not invited. From 1978 into 1979, the group entered its most fragile stretch, without any headline-grabbing fights or public blow-ups. On the surface, they were still together, but inside the ground was already cracked. Lionel began appearing in the press more and more as an individual rather than as just one member of a unit. Interviews centered on him. Magazine layouts positioned him at the middle of the photos. These were small details, but repeated often enough they started to cut. According to some accounts, a few members eventually approached Lionel, not with shouting, but with one quiet question: was the Commodores still his home? There is no official transcript of that conversation, no recorded argument. But after that point, everything seemed to accelerate. Lionel started preparing for his own path. The others watching the direction of the spotlight understood that the story was no longer theirs to shape. In 1979, Lionel Richie left the Commodores. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no televised breakup, no angry statement in the press. Motown released a brief announcement. Commentators called it the obvious next step for a rising star. But for the men who had shared sleepless nights in cramped vans, played to half-empty rooms, and believed they would rise or fall together, it landed like a silent blow. It felt to some like a betrayal without open accusation, a separation made colder because no one truly said what they were feeling. Lionel walked into his solo era surrounded by flashbulbs and praise. The Commodores were left standing in the shadow of what they had built together, holding a sense of abandonment that would take years to fade if it ever did. In that quiet rupture, the first brick of tragedy was set in place. Lionel Richie's personal success did not start with a clean, triumphant break. It began with a separation whose emotional aftershocks would echo for years. And this was only the first loss in the long list of things Lionel would trade away for fame. Chapter 2. The solo peak in a marriage crushed. When Lionel Richie stepped into the 1980s, he did it alone. The safety net of the group was gone. He was no longer sharing a spotlight. He was the spotlight. Los Angeles stretched out in front of him like a glittering promise that never slept, studio lights glowing long after midnight, limousines idling outside guarded gates, phone lines buzzing with new offers. According to those around him at the time, every door that had once been closed now seemed to swing open on its own. In 1982, his self-titled debut solo album arrived. It didn't just sell, it moved in waves, climbing the charts until Lionel Richie was no longer just the former voice of a band. Within a few months, he had become one of the biggest solo stars in America. The transition was so fast, so smooth from the outside that few people stopped to ask a simple question: what would all this success demand in return? From that point, Lionel's life no longer moved in a straight line. It shattered into fragments and schedules that barely connected. Days disappeared into interviews, photo shoots, meetings, and endless studio hours. Nights were spent on planes, in anonymous hotel rooms, and under stage lights in city after city. There were weeks when, according to later accounts, he could barely remember which time zone he had landed in. There were months when the only view he had of his own house in Los Angeles was through a car window as he sped past on his way out again. Back home, the house he shared with his wife Brenda Harvey began to change in a way no one could see in photographs. It was still spacious, still beautifully decorated, but slowly it started to feel more like an empty shell than a home. The silence there was no longer peaceful. It was the kind that echoed. In 1983, when the album Can't Slow Down pushed Lionel beyond national success into global superstardom, his schedule effectively stopped belonging to him. The tours stretched farther across the United States into Europe, then into Asia. He would land, perform, smile for cameras, and then leave again, often with almost no time in between. American television screens filled with his image: Lionel laughing, Lionel talking about love, Lionel describing tenderness and deep emotion with a calm, reassuring tone. But at that same moment, according to people close to the couple, his marriage to Brenda was entering its darkest corridor. Brenda was not living with a celebrity. She was living with an absence. Lionel was rarely home long enough for the house to feel inhabited. Dinners were missed. Conversations were cut short or postponed. He came in late and left early. There were nights, it was said, when Brenda waited in that large, quiet house, hearing a car pull in at the gate, only to watch Lionel rush inside, grab a bag or a change of clothes, and disappear again within minutes. The distance between them did not arrive all at once. It stacked up, tour after tour, promise after promise, to return early that quietly dissolved into another delay. People in their circle later claimed that during this time they saw Lionel begin to harden. He became more guarded, more easily irritated, more withdrawn into a world only he seemed to understand. Fame had given him power, money, and influence, but it also built a wall. It made him harder to reach even for the person who had known him for years. Every argument, every unresolved tension in the marriage was pushed into the background with a familiar excuse: work. Brenda, left behind in the silence, began to feel what many partners of stars eventually feel, that she was slowly losing her husband to something she couldn't compete with, a career that demanded all of him. The cruelest part of this tragedy was the contrast between perception and reality. Outside, Lionel Richie was praised as the ideal romantic man. Inside his home, suspicion had already begun to creep in. Long trips without clear explanations. Missed calls. Stories that over time felt thinner and less believable. Brenda did not have proof she could show the world, but she had the instincts of a wife who could feel herself being pushed out of her own life. The public never saw the arguments, the quiet tears, or the tense, unfinished conversations that filled those walls. What they did see were carefully controlled appearances, Lionel and Brenda side by side, at events, smiles held for as long as the cameras were flashing, hands held for just enough seconds to look convincing in photographs. Then when the lights went off, they walked in different directions inside the same house. It was a marriage that still existed on paper and in pictures, but was slowly dying in private. According to people involved, there were moments when Brenda tried to pull Lionel back. She confronted him directly, tried to talk about what was happening instead of pretending everything was fine. But by then Lionel was no longer the young man from Tuskegee who had once moved in step with a group. He was a global star under relentless pressure to deliver hits, to remain visible, to always be Lionel Richie, as the world imagined him. Under that load, he began to treat the marriage as something that could be repaired later when things calmed down, when the tours slowed, when there was finally time. That time never came. From 1980 to 1984, the public saw what looked like the brightest, cleanest peak of Lionel Richie's career. The albums soared. The awards piled up. The love songs became cultural landmarks. But underneath that peak, in the spaces no camera captured those same years, were laying the first solid bricks of a marital tragedy. There was no single explosion, no dramatic scene that ended everything at once. Instead, there were cracks, small at first, then wider, then impossible to ignore. And Lionel, standing between roaring crowds and hotel room silence, did not fully grasp what he was losing. For all the applause and all the success, there was only one place that had ever truly called him a husband instead of a star. And that place was slipping away long before the world realized anything was wrong. Chapter 3. The Night That Shattered the Image. After months of living with questions, she could not answer. June 25, 1988, became the night Brenda Harvey stopped guessing. The suspicions, the late returns, the explanations that no longer felt solid, all of it led her to one decision. Close to midnight, she drove alone through the quiet, polished streets of Beverly Hills, past trimmed hedges and guarded gates into a neighborhood built to keep problems hidden behind thick walls and warm yellow light. There was no warning phone call, no carefully laid-out plan. Brenda was not following a script. She simply knew that if she stayed home, she would remain trapped inside a doubt that had already eaten away too many nights. When she pulled up in front of one particular house, brightly lit windows, glowing across multiple rooms, something in her registered that this was not the look of a quick visit or a late work session. It felt lived in. It felt occupied. That was enough. She stepped out of the car carrying years of exhaustion, jealousy, hurt, and quiet rage on her shoulders. According to later accounts, she walked straight to the door and went inside. The scene that greeted her in the living room confirmed what she had been afraid to name out loud. Lionel Richie was there, and he was not alone. The woman in that house that night was Diane Alexander. There was no time for clumsy excuses, no chance to rearrange the facts. In a matter of seconds, every suspicion Brenda had tried to push away snapped into harsh focus. The marriage she had tried to hold together was suddenly exposed at its weakest point. Her reaction came fast. According to police records and later reports, Brenda confronted them in a raised voice and moved deeper into the house as emotions spun out of control. Objects in the living room were damaged framed photographs, decorative pieces, things that had once been carefully placed to tell a story of stability and success. Family pictures that had hung on the wall to project happiness fell and shattered on the floor with flat, unsettling sounds. Lionel tried to step in. Witnesses later said he moved toward Brenda, attempting to calm her down, reaching out to physically hold her back. But once betrayal is no longer imagined, but seen, logic and soothing words lose their power. Brenda turned her attention toward Diane Alexander. Long-buried tension erupted into physical contact. It was not a drawn-out brawl, but it was serious enough to push everything beyond the boundaries of a private argument. The noises, the shouting, the crashes spilled out into the Beverly Hills night, cutting through the usual quiet of the neighborhood. Curtains shifted. Neighbors took notice. A phone call was made. Minutes later, police cars rolled up to the house, red and blue lights flashing against the white exterior, bouncing off fragments of glass and scattered belongings inside. When officers entered, the chaos had been partially contained. The people involved were separated. Voices dropped to a low, controlled volume. What followed was procedure questions asked in neutral tones, statements taken, details recorded. Inside that cold process, one decision changed everything. In a development that stunned the public when it surfaced, Brenda Harvey was arrested on charges that included assault and property damage. The image of her being led away in handcuffs did more than shock the family. It tore apart the story the public had believed in for years, that of a solid romantic household built around one of America's most trusted voices. By the morning of June 26, the 1988, the story had broken. American media seized on the incident with speed and hunger. For the first time, Lionel Richie's name appeared in headlines, not because of a new album or a sold-out tour, but because of a private life turned into front-page scandal. Words like infidelity, assault, and domestic trouble began to stick to the image of a man who had long been advertised as the safest, most composed romantic figure in pop music. The public was not ready for the contrast. For years, Lionel Richie had represented something almost spotless, a gentle voice singing about love, safety, and devotion. Now the same man was connected to police reports, a late-night confrontation, and a wife in handcuffs. The shock didn't come only from what happened, but from the feeling of collective disappointment. The illusion of perfection had been broken in a single night. After Beverly Hills, Lionel Richie withdrew from the spotlight for a time. According to reports, meetings with lawyers, advisors, and publicists took place behind closed doors as strategies were developed, statements drafted, and damage assessed. But no matter how carefully the narrative was managed, that night could not be erased. It became a clear dividing line in his life and career. Before June 25, the 1988 Lionel's image was that of a carefully crafted gentleman of love songs. After that night, every appearance, every interview, every performance carried an invisible shadow. What followed were years marked by fallout, divorce proceedings, legal conflicts, and a deep personal collapse that Lionel himself rarely addressed in detail. The Beverly Hills incident did not just mark the end of a marriage. It ended the era when the public could believe fully in the version of Lionel Richie shown on album covers and television specials. From that night on, every time he stood under stage lights and sang about love, there was another story running silently alongside the lyrics, a story the audience could no longer completely ignore. Chapter 4: Divorce, Isolation, and Disappearance from the Peak. After the night in Beverly Hills, Lionel Richie's life did not explode in a spectacle the world could point to. It came apart from the inside quietly, steadily, in ways that didn't make headlines but left deep marks. By the end of 1988, as newspapers and TV shows shifted their focus to fresher scandals, Lionel returned to something resembling private life. Only this time there was no illusion of safety left. The Los Angeles house was still expansive, still elegant, still the kind of place meant to signal success. But to the man walking through its rooms, it no longer felt like home. The air seemed heavy, thick with unspoken arguments and unresolved guilt. Even simple tasks, opening the door, turning on a light, could feel exhausting. Conversations became shorter, fewer, and more careful. Nights grew longer, and the silence that once felt peaceful turned into something sharp and suffocating. From 1989 into the early 1990, as Lionel Richie and Brenda Harvey were technically still married, but what remained was not a partnership. It was a prolonged retreat. According to people familiar with the situation, they rarely spoke directly unless it involved logistics. Lawyers began to appear more often than friends or relatives. Every encounter seemed to revolve around documents, financial questions, legal obligations. What had once been built out of emotion and shared history was now being measured, divided, and argued over in cool legal language. Even small details, who got what, who paid for which, could trigger disagreements that dragged on for weeks. Their life together, piece by piece, was being broken down into assets and responsibilities. Meanwhile, the public still waited for Lionel Richie to do the thing they thought he was born to do: release another massive hit. Fans and even industry insiders assumed that once he stepped back into the studio, the music would fix everything. But Lionel was fighting a different kind of battle, one he didn't know how to win. Success had taught him how to climb, how to stay on top. It had never taught him how to fall with any kind of grace. In 1993, after years of tension, Lionel Richie and Brenda Harvey officially divorced. A judge's ruling closed almost 2 decades of marriage, but it didn't bring relief or closure. According to reports, the divorce process itself had been long, bitter, and draining, with asset disputes that left both sides exhausted. There were no victors, only 2 people watching their shared life reduced to numbers and terms on a page. For Lionel, it was a quiet rock bottom. There was no dramatic breakdown for cameras to capture, but privately he began to understand something painful. Fame does not prepare anyone for losing the parts of life that cannot be replaced. Songs can be re-recorded. Tours can be rescheduled. A home, a marriage, a sense of belonging, those are not so easy to rebuild. After the divorce, Lionel didn't spiral into obvious chaos. He didn't stage outbursts or chase controversy. Instead, he faded. Public appearances dropped sharply. Some projects were postponed without clear reasons. Studios and labels found him hesitant, unsure. The man who had once walked into recording sessions with near absolute confidence now second-guessed decisions he previously made without thinking. When he did speak, he used polite phrases: he needed rest, he was taking time, he was regrouping. But behind those careful words, very few people saw the truth. Lionel Richie was emotionally and mentally drained. Around this time, backstage rumors began to spread throughout the Los Angeles entertainment world. Some people whispered that Lionel no longer had the focus necessary to work at the pace the industry demanded. Others claimed he had developed a pattern of backing out of commitments at the last minute. There were quiet suggestions that he relied on sleep medication to make it through his nights after the divorce. These details were never publicly proven, but his long absence from the center of the music scene made those stories easier for some to accept. Certain tabloids went further in ways that cut deeper. They started asking cruel, loaded questions, hinting that Lionel Richie might be drifting down the same road that many black artists before him were believed to have traveled once they peaked, left behind by the industry, trapped by an old image, unable to adjust as the world moved on. Those narratives did not need to be fully accurate. Their existence alone was enough to wound. Lionel did not answer. He let the rumors stand, allowed the silence to fill in the gaps. And in that silence, other people continued writing his story for him. While Lionel withdrew, the music world was changing quickly. In the early 1990s, hip-hop and a new wave of R&B surged forward. Younger artists began telling unfiltered stories about city life, inequality, and survival without smoothing the edges. On radio playlists, gentle romantic ballads from a middle-aged man who had dominated the 1980s started to sound like echoes from another era. No one called a press conference to declare Lionel Richie finished. They simply stopped expecting him. Charts reflected the shift without emotion. New songs he released did not create the earthquakes they once had. For someone who had defined an entire era, this quiet slide into the background wasn't dramatic, but it slowly eroded his sense of worth. For the first time since his rise, Lionel Richie realized he stood outside the main conversation. The spotlight had moved on, and he was not standing in it. He had to learn how to exist in that strange place, visible, but no longer central. In interviews years later, Lionel would describe this period as a state of prolonged burnout, not a single dramatic collapse, but a dull, persistent emptiness. He talked about waking up without knowing where to start his day, about feeling lost as every anchor in his life shifted at once, the marriage gone, the career slowed down, the once perfect image stained. He also spoke about isolation. When he was the star, people crowded around him. After the scandal, after the divorce, after the slowdown, the crowd thinned. Relationships built on success began to dissolve. The phone rang less often. Invitations declined. Lionel started to grasp the difference between being admired and being truly accompanied. One is loud and temporary. The other is quiet and rare. In that new emptiness, the noise of fame faded, and the silence of real life took its place. Mild depression, by his own account, slipped in, not in dramatic scenes, but in a slow, heavy drag that made everything feel harder. Still, Lionel did not attempt a wild reinvention. He didn't chase controversy for relevance. He didn't try to dress younger or copy the new generation. He chose something far more dangerous in his line of work. He chose silence. In an industry that demands constant presence, silence often looks like surrender. That absence convinced many observers that Lionel Richie had effectively disappeared. But in reality, he was doing something few icons are allowed to do, learning to live without the constant applause that had once defined him. The years 1994 and 1995 passed, with barely a ripple in popular culture attached to his name. He continued making music, but without the urgency to dominate charts. He appeared less frequently and more selectively. His concerts leaned toward nostalgia, built for those who had grown up with his songs. For devoted fans, the voice still mattered. For the broader market, Lionel had stepped away from competition, and for the first time he didn't try to fight his way back in. The stretch from 1988 to 1995 became the darkest corridor in Lionel Richie's story. Not because he lacked talent or because he suddenly failed at his craft, but because he no longer knew who he was without the height he had once stood on. No album could fully answer that question. No applause could completely fill that hollow space. Yet inside this long, difficult chapter, another Lionel Richie slowly began to form, less glamorous, less dependent on constant validation. A man trying to relearn how to exist after the lights had gone down and the crowd had gone home. Chapter 5. Surviving after the legend. As the 2000s began, Lionel Richie did not storm off the stage or announce a dramatic farewell. He simply stepped back. There was no press conference, no scandal powerful enough to force him into hiding. Instead, something quieter happened. His name appeared less and less in the center of the cultural conversation. Radio shifted. Television moved on. The charts chased new sounds. And Lionel, once a dominant force, found himself watching from the side. The silence that followed was not some carefully designed strategy. It was the residue of years of exhaustion, emotional, mental, and physical. Every new invitation carried an unspoken question. Did he still belong in the room in those early years of the new decade? Lionel continued to make music, but the process was no longer automatic. The studio door, which had once swung open with excitement, now felt heavier. According to his later accounts, there were mornings when he sat at the piano with his hands resting on the keys, not because he had no ideas, but because he was afraid of what might come out. Afraid that the songs he wrote would no longer reach anyone. Afraid that anything new would be endlessly measured against the legend he had already created and would be found lacking. Afraid of becoming nothing more than an echo of Lionel Richie, the icon. His private life offered no real refuge. Lionel grew increasingly guarded. He skipped parties, declined industry events, and reduced his social circle to a small, tightly controlled group. Those close to him described stretches of time when he seemed to live almost in isolation, moving only through a narrow loop home studio, small tours, then back again. Romantic relationships did exist, but they unfolded quietly. They did not become tabloid headlines, not because they weren't real, but because Lionel no longer wanted his personal life dissected by strangers. Behind the scenes, whispers continued to circulate in Hollywood. Some said Lionel had become harder to work with. Others claimed he turned down high-profile opportunities because he refused to be a nostalgic backdrop for newer, trendier acts. There were people who believed he simply could not bear the idea of no longer being at the center. None of these stories were fully confirmed, but they all pointed toward a deeper truth. Lionel Richie was living with a persistent fear of being pushed permanently aside, a fear familiar to many artists who have stayed at the top for too long. Lionel later admitted that the heaviest pressure did not come from fans, executives, or critics. It came from himself. He spoke openly about the burden of perfection, the belief that as an icon, he was never allowed to fail. When you have once been a defining voice of an era, any step backward looks like defeat. Any pause sounds like the end. Inside that mindset, Lionel carried a specific dread, the fear of being judged as irrelevant by the very industry he had helped shape. For many years, Lionel existed in an uncomfortable space between extremes. He was no longer the unstoppable force that commanded radio and award shows. But he was not completely gone either. He kept touring mostly for the fans who had been there since the beginning. Those shows were less like competition and more like remembrance. On stage, he didn't try to reinvent himself. He didn't chase youth. He simply sang the songs that people had woven into the fabric of their own lives. Even then, a kind of distance remained. The roar of the crowd could not fully erase the awareness that he was now seen through a lens of nostalgia. The turning point when it came arrived in an unexpected form. In 2018, Lionel Richie agreed to serve as a judge on American Idol. For some observers, this move raised uncomfortable questions. Was this an admission that he had entered the legend from the past phase? Would sitting behind a judging panel reduce him to background commentary on younger talent? There were fears that the role might dilute the myth of Lionel Richie the star. Lionel saw it differently. In that chair, he did not present himself as a man clinging to old glory. He sat there as someone who had already walked the long road through early hunger, towering success, scandal, divorce, burnout, and survival. Instead of judging contestants from a distance, he often told them stories. Instead of lecturing, he shared experiences. His comments weren't academic. They came from scars, from nights on stage, from contracts negotiated, from losses still felt. The audience began to look at him with new eyes. He was no longer just a distant icon from the 1980, frozen in time by music videos and award shows. He became something else, a living witness to the shifting history of American music. At an age when many legends retreat entirely, Lionel was still present, willing to sit under bright lights and speak honestly about what it costs to chase a dream for decades. Another side of him surfaced as well. He did not pretend to be untouchable. In interviews tied to the show, he spoke candidly about fearing replacement, about standing outside studios, unsure if he still deserved the name he had built. He admitted that there were times when he was afraid to write, afraid to record, afraid that the world no longer had a place for him. Those admissions startled people who had once assumed that superstardom insulated him from insecurity. But that vulnerability did something powerful. It allowed audiences, especially older viewers, to connect with him, not as a legend on a pedestal, but as a human being who had been through multiple lifetimes in a single career. They no longer compared him to his younger self. They saw a man who had survived his own story. In these later years, Lionel's private life also settled into a quieter balance. He learned to move at a slower pace, to accept empty spaces in his schedule instead of fearing them. The urge to prove his relevance at every turn began to fade. He stopped treating the top of the mountain as the only place that mattered. Lionel has said that only after he released his grip on perfection did he start to feel lighter. It was not surrender. It was acceptance. Today, Lionel Richie is not the center of pop culture in the way he once was, and he no longer needs to be. He remains not as a constant headliner, but as a steady presence, a name that has never fully disappeared. He doesn't deny the past or try to outrun it. The old songs still play, but for many people, they now carry new layers of meaning. They are not just about romance anymore. They are about endurance. About living through scandal, heartbreak, public judgment, and the slow fading of fame, and still finding a way to stand. The final act of Lionel Richie's story is not a flashy comeback, not a chart-dominating reinvention. It is something more unsettling, and in its own way, more profound, the story of a man who learned how to exist after his legend ended. A man who once spent years terrified of being forgotten and eventually discovered that value is not measured by staying at the very top, but by having the courage to keep living when the world has moved on. Lionel Richie is not only a songwriter whose melodies shape generations of love stories. He is also proof that when the brightest lights finally dim, there is still another life waiting, smaller, quieter, but far more honest. His journey holds more than soft ballads and happy endings. It contains secret scandals, long silences, and a deep loneliness that fame could never fix. From the night in Beverly Hills that shattered the spotless image to a drawn-out divorce,